welcome everyone to this spotlight session that is titled Unlock and Unleash Unknown Potential. And I have a suspicion that the unknown piece will feature very highly in what we're going to discuss. The subtitle is Moving from 2D to 3D to really know your people. And it's a real pleasure of mine to introduce Malini Janakiraman, who, I mean, we know each other for a very long time and have worked together in so many circumstances. I'm delighted that we are working together again as part of the Inclusive Leadership Institute. And what you have to offer is a particularly important perspective when it comes to how do we as leaders, as inclusive leaders, actually relate to the people that are looking to us for leadership. So without further ado, Malini, please take it away.
Thank you, Jorg, and thank you, Christine. Hello, everyone. You know, today I would like to spotlight a topic that I feel is fundamental and often the cause for many root cause issues. It's based on my 25 plus years in corporate life as an employee, as a consultant, traveling all over the US and the globe. And it's a phenomenon that I have noticed when it comes to leading others, certainly applicable in a peer-to-peer situation as well, but in leading others. And here's my premise, and I'd love to hear from all of you in the Q&A as to what you think about it as I unfold my premise. What I have to share may sound deceptively simple, but I'd like to propose that it is simple and has tremendous power to tap into people's potentials, to lead effectively and inclusively. And the most important thing here is we're not doing it that effectively for the most part. That's my premise. And I'd love to hear from all of you as I unfold. So my thought here is to ask all of you as leaders, inclusive leaders, do you really know your people? Do you really know your people? And like Jorg said, that potential, that's where I'm going to ask you about thinking about unlocking that potential and all that it means if you do so. Because you see, I think our
I think we are having a technical issue at the moment, so Malini should come right back. And there she is. Malini, you were frozen for a moment, so you may have to repeat some aspects of what you were talking about. I apologize for that.
So what I was saying is that we have a tendency to have a 2D look, right? Flat. But if we can move to a lens that has depth, a 3D lens, then what happens here is you are able to see things that you may not have seen before. And how appropriate that we've got the logo of the Inclusive Leadership Institute, which in itself is a cube with a 3D lens, right? And so a lot of what we're going to be talking about is this notion that ties right back to this, the meta look at an individual, right? So let me start with why this is important. But before I get there, I'm going to ask all of you to do something. Please, wherever you are, you can grab a pencil, a paper if you want to. You don't have to. You can just make a mental note of what I'm asking. But I'm going to ask you, put down and think about all the dimensions that make up who you are. And I'm going to share some of mine in a minute, right? But think about you, everything that makes up you, who you are. You can make a mental note, you could write it down, but I'd like you to come up with a list. Let me give you examples of mine. South Asian, female, wife, mother, grandmother, multilingual immigrant, short by American standards, CPA, meditator, singer, ex-field hockey player, ex-tennis player, devout Hindu. You get the gist, right? So take your time and just jot those down mentally or on a piece of paper. Now comes the most important piece that I'd like you to take a look at that list of who you are, those attributes. And then I'd ask you to ask yourself 3 questions. How have these dimensions shaped you? 1, how have they shaped your skills, your attitude, your knowledge? 2, how have the intersection of these dimensions shaped you? It's not just 1, but when 1 plus 1 often makes 4. So the intersection. And I'm going to give you a lot of examples that I've seen in my travels. And finally, how much of this have you had an opportunity to share with someone who has led you? Share with a feeling of safety. How much have you had the opportunity to share with someone who leads you or leads you now, led you in the past, in a safe space? I hope you can kind of see what I'm going after here. It's a 30-minute session, so and it's not going to be something that I'm going to ask you to share, but certainly put things in Q&A as they pop up. But please use this as a backdrop as I go through my premise of the why, what, and the how. The why, what, and the how. So here's the why. Human beings are multidimensional. It's a natural tendency for us to engage with, we are multidimensional, but our natural tendency is to engage with a flat 2-dimensional binary lens. As a result, the power of visible and invisible multi-dimensions and the skills from the intersection of these dimensions are not often unlocked or unleashed, right? Let me give you a quick example of what I'm talking about here. As I said, I'm a Hindu and I'm a tennis player, and all this makes up who I am. I mentioned that. But very often, the way I was viewed, I worked in South Bend, Indiana for many, many, many years. What I was viewed was South Asian woman, CPA. Of course, they could see I was short. But they did not know about the duty or the dharma that came in with that, which often showed up as working and making things work very well. So tendency to engage with a 2-dimensional view rather than 3-dimensional view, right? And the power of these intersections, when they're unlocked or unleashed, is amazing. Now, often these are root causes for retention issues, pipeline issues, belonging, inclusion, etc. I mean, Jorg and I have talked about this quite a bit. When you hire for diversity and people come in, you want to take advantage of the differences that they bring, but you have to get to know them first, right? Otherwise, the inclusiveness doesn't happen, right? And the last point here for me is very, very important. I do believe that leadership is all about service. And if you don't even know your people, this is why it's so important, how can you become a service-oriented leader? It's mired in superficiality, if you will. Right? So this is my premise. Now, what is it? You just laid out all your dimensions. So we are, as I said, multidimensional, and you can see a definition involving several dimensions. We talked about the intersection. And let me give you an example of how I saw this play out beautifully. There was a gentleman from Mexico who was in a wheelchair in a professional services organization that I worked with. He was from Mexico and was a very, very, very good at what he did as an accountant. But every morning he had to get into this wheelchair to get ready and go to work. Now, that's one dimension. He also was the youngest of 10 children growing up. So what he's shared with me is the following. Malini, people often see me as an accountant in a wheelchair. But I have to tell you, I bring negotiation skills. Being the youngest of 10 children, every moment was a negotiation for me to get things done. And do you know the patience I have to use to get up in the morning, get ready, get dressed, get to work? Invisible, but it's me. So if you think about the intersection of patience and negotiations skills, and you think about how you would use this person in problem solving, hopefully you can understand what I'm saying. Jörg, can you still hear me?
Absolutely.
Great.
Yes.
Just checking into my internet connection. Great. So what we're asking you to think about is the visible and the invisible dimensions, right? Probe, learn, understand the totality of these dimensions and the untapped potential that comes with it, right? It's natural and powerful. And I've heard other speakers in the Inclusive Leadership Institute, this word meta comes up very often. So this is metacognition. That's what I'm asking you to think about. Cognition that gives insights, increases the information you use, reduces the risk of basic errors. I'm Six Sigma trained. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that, right? Double loop learning. So reduces the risk of basic errors. And I can't say enough about this, fosters belonging, right? Because you get to know people much better. You know, one of the things I have to just say that when I did sessions, the people who were in the room, the white men and the white women would often say to me, you know what, we get lumped into this category of all white men, all white women. I'm sure that happens with other ethnicities as well. But I noticed that, you know, because there is a feeling sometimes of being, quote, left out, because you don't see them as individuals with a lot of dimensions, but you're putting them into these categories, if you will, right? So I hope that gives you the sense of the what. Now, let's go back to this. What else does it enable? Double loops your learning, right? So what do I mean by that? Single loop learning says, I look at what I did, I look at the results of my actions, and as a result, and I take that, and that's the premise on which I go forward. Single loop learning. And you know, sometimes we got to do that in the moment, if you will. But double loop learning, and my premise here is that when you use this notion of looking at individuals, that's what you're doing. Double loop learning focuses on the assumptions you made to get to where you needed to go, that predicated your actions, adjusts your goal-directed thinking, engages in a second loop of thought, and assumptions are evaluated. I can't say enough about that. Assumptions are evaluated. Let me give you an example that I'm sure my friend Vince Varello would say yay to, because I did hear him talk about leading in English on this course, right? Just say you have someone who speaks with an accent that's not the accent, the predominant accent of the region. And you have him present, or her present, to a client. And you're listening to this, and you see that the client asks a couple of questions, stops the person and asks a couple of questions for clarification. Now, it slows down the presentation and they may not get to everything that they wanted to get to. And so single loop learning will say, oh, the result of putting this person in front of the client was it slowed down the presentation. There was no clarity because of the accent. I'm not sure I want to put this person in front of the client again. All right, let's step back and let's double loop the learning. When you double loop your learning, you focus on the assumptions that predicated the actions, right? This person has the knowledge and the skills that the client needs. And whose discomfort was that? Was it the client's discomfort or my own discomfort with the action, right? With the accent, right? Maybe I need to also ask, what kinds of questions did the client ask for clarification? Was it about what the content, which had nothing to do with the way the gentleman or the woman was speaking? So you see, when you double loop your learning, you're stepping back and thinking about your assumptions, and you say, "Oh no, I really do want this person on the client engagement." I hope that gives you a sense of what I'm talking about, right? See, Six Sigma says, and we apply this to all processes, operational and administrative, says, you look at the defects, but you correct it based on all assumptions, taking into account all assumptions. Why don't we do that with human relationships? That's what I'm talking about here, right? Doing it and stepping back and taking a 3D view allows you to do that, if you will, right? And here's another premise that I'd like to share with you, which is heuristics, right? A big word, but let me just make it very simple for you. Depending on where you are raised, how you encode perspectives, and the cognitive frameworks you use, how you see problems, the frameworks that you use to rely on to reach solutions are different depending on where you're raised, right? And so if you are used to seeing only a two-dimensional view of people, often you assume that people encode or that they see, their cognitive frameworks are like your own, but not necessarily, right? That's the learning mode of the leader. That's the learning mode of the leader. Let me give you a couple of examples. The eve of change, Pamela Carlton interviewed many different women in the C-suite. And one Latino C-suite leader, the lady said, you know, my life was in a large multi-generational family, and I was constantly being the catalyst. And so my heuristics, my perspectives are all about how do I make relationships get me to where I need to go. Now, if you are not used to that, you may not see that dimension unless you talk, unless you get to know this individual, right? If you have an analyst from India who happened to grow up in Mumbai, just ask him about running to catch the bus and hanging on to the bus until he got to work, and all that it takes to navigate those perspectives to get to where he needs to be, or making the internet work. So all these are aware of that makes a person a very good problem solver. So you've got to get to know them, right? And I'll tell you one more example. Early in my career, I led a Black lady who worked for me. She was the only Black woman in the subdivision of a large Fortune 500 company. And she said to me, you know, she could get anything done. And I used to marvel at it. And she said to me, you know, you have to remember, I have been so used to being the only one in so many situations. Nothing phases me. I can help you solve your problems. You just give it to me and I'll figure out how to get it done, right? So a couple of examples, I hope, that gives you a sense of heuristics and how encoding perspectives are so different, but you got to know your people to get to know them, to unleash that potential. So benefits, let me give you a little bit of why is this important. I told you earlier when we started, it's a very important premise. Okay, so you may say why. Moving from diversity to inclusiveness. Bring people in that are diverse, I mentioned it before, but unless you get to know them and tap into their potential, it's likely not lead to inclusiveness. Now, equitable promotions. I have to tell you, think about who gets sponsored, who moves up, and do you really know the potential that a person has in order to build a pipeline? Let me share with you a recent research. The broken rung is what they call it. McKinsey lead-in report just came out, 2022. And it is about women at work. They interviewed or surveyed 40,000 employees, 325 companies, a lot of good data. And here's what they're finding. That first step to manager, for every 100 men, 87 women are promoted, 82 women of color, and 75 Latino women. And therefore, the pipeline, when it isn't there. So is this going to solve, is the three-dimensional view going to solve all your problems on the broken rung? No. But what I'd like to ask you is the following. If you don't know your people well enough to advocate for them, how can you put them up for promotion? So I would say one really good way to help with this broken rung is to get to know your people. Get to know your people. And then there is this great breakup. Everyone's talking about the resignations and people are leaving and so on. Now, so many companies now have the slogan, get more, retain them. Get more, retain them. I'd say if you don't change your processes, that's not going to work, right? That's not going to work. So one of the processes you can change is to get to know your people a little bit more, see, because for every, again, the same data says that for every one woman that's promoted, 2 are leaving. And the younger folks are leaving even more than, the millennials and the Gen Zs. This is becoming even more important. Innovation on teams. Please look at this quote from Dr. Scott Page. I love the gentleman. He's written the book called The Difference. Complex systems analysis professor at Ann Arbor. Innovation requires thinking differently. So how do your people think differently so you could put them on the team? Valerie Purdue-Vaughn, I must say, I really enjoyed her presentation that she did the other day about the brain and social inclusion, right? She talks about inauthentic inclusion. If you're just nodding your head and saying, I know my people, yes, they belong. I know they, do they really? Do they feel that authenticity? And have you thought about another one? Something else she said was identity-based belonging. What about thinking about those that are different and asking the question, how can I flex a little bit more to help with their belonging? Get to know them a little bit more, right? I already referred to Vince. I mean, he'll tell you a lot about this notion of leading in English and hearing only the accents and not the leadership element of the gentleman. And he spends a lot of time with that, right? And Jessica Mayer so eloquently talked about disability, right? Now, again, if your 2D view sees a person who's disabled, but not what that actually enables them to do, then it really doesn't give you the opportunity to serve your people. So I hope you get a sense of the potential benefits here. And then the most important question here is, so how do we do it? Jorg and I have often asked this word about genuine. We've talked about it, right? Can it be cultivated? Being genuine in your curiosity, right? But my premise is that you really can develop it. I really do think that if you start asking the questions, how can I change as a servant leader? And you keep asking the questions, when am I inauthentic? Then I feel like that genuineness is part of how you become curious and how you ask the questions, right? Ask open-ended questions with the intent of listening, right? Listening. What shaped you? Just like I asked you in the beginning, right? What shaped you? Please tell me more. Now, of course, there are people, maybe some of you thinking, well, what if I get with this Me Too movement and everything else going on in the world? What if HR slaps me on my shoulder and says, oh, no, you shouldn't. So there is that concern, if you will, as how society is kind of moving and changing. But I'm going to tell you, please don't let that stop you. Because if you approach it with authenticity and genuine curiosity and ask people questions, they're usually more than happy to open up. They're more than happy to open up. And, if you happen to have introverts who need to take that time, give them that space. That's okay. But coming across as a leader who cares, dropping the judgments and assumptions, double looping your learning, right? So important. Checking your biases. Can't say enough about this, because if you're already biased and you're having a conversation with them, let's just say you're looking at on Zoom and the lady is wearing a hijab. And if you can't get beyond that head covering, you're not going to be checking your biases, right? And so you've got to check your biases every minute. And I have to tell you, I have really worked on this. My judgments and my assumptions, because I am a very quick to judge person. I really am. It's parcel of maybe my CPA, years of doing audit work, but and I am getting better. I am much, much better. And this notion of psychological safety, when I asked the question earlier, 3 questions, what, who are you? What are your intersections? Have you shared it with someone? Likely that you're not sharing it if you don't feel psychological safety. You might ask, Malini, you worked in South Bend, Indiana, and you say you were buttoned up and people didn't know all about you. Why didn't you share? Because I didn't feel safe. It's as simple as that. See, there is this notion of subjective experience that I feel strongly about. You might say, oh, I can speak up. I'm very open, et cetera, et cetera. But if you are an immigrant, if you are in the margins sometimes, you don't always feel safe to open up unless you are invited. Unless you are invited with genuine curiosity, if you will, right? Now here's so as Jorg said, a lot of unlocking, right? Now let me talk about the unleashing, because that's extremely important too, to get the most out of your people. How can I advocate for this individual, right? So you know this about the gentleman who's in the wheelchair that I talked about. Malini speaks many languages. She brings a sense of duty. So how can I advocate for her when it comes to promotions, when it comes to sponsorship, when it comes to telling people who she really is, not just the 2D look, right? Give us the opportunities to lead teams, perhaps, right? Or, mentoring and sponsorship is the way people get ahead, right? And right now, it just isn't. And so unless you know your people and you can take advantage of the dimensions they bring to the table, likely that you can't cast your net out widely. So take stock. Who am I who am I promoting? Who am I an ally for and advocating, right? And, you know, I'll come back to this notion of servant leadership, because therefore, when you serve, you become a truly inclusive, effective leader. Robert Greenleaf is one of my favorite people. He wrote this thin orange book that I have used for years and years in my travel. Very simple. And all he says is, servant leaders place the interest and needs of their followers ahead of their own. And it's a very simple premise, but that's what he is suggesting. So I hope you get a sense of the how, you know, the why, the what, and the how. And there is this notion of working virtually, right? I will talk about this and do a little wrap up afterwards. But when you work virtually, question will be, how do you get this done? Every one of the elements we discussed in the previous slide are still very, very important. But I have to tell you, my premise is it will take more deliberate time and effort. It will. And so I think you just need to be prepared for that as leaders, right? And I think this bullet point about checking biases, if you're using only media to interact, is particularly important. Because, you know, in fact, we were doing work with a group of people in India, and I remember the lady there saying, when people are giving final year reports, very often, if they are speaking with a certain accent, remember in India, there are accents and there are accents and there are acceptable accents. When people are speaking with a certain accent, our biases are up there on media right away. And so checking your biases, if you're using virtual media to interact, becomes particularly important, right? Now the research, and I'd love to hear from you in Q&A if you feel differently, but my look at the research is mixed. Some people think working virtually is good, minimizes differences, you know, and I'll tell you, no one knows how tall I am when I'm on Zoom. I have to tell you, I can make eye contact, and so definitely I would say that's a plus. And some people who are introverts have also said, you know, I can pace myself. I don't have to keep up with everyone the same way. Well, other introverts say, no, I don't even get a chance to speak up. So some agree, some don't. And I talked about that, the lady with the hijab, you know, and she says sometimes that's all they see of my face on Zoom. And so there's likely that my words are not heard. Now, I'll just give you one piece of data that blew me away, and I just want to put that out there. Again, it's that same report, which is very well done. The McKinsey report says that women of color and LGBTQ plus and those with disabilities say that they feel less microaggressions and more safety when they work remotely. You know, I have to tell you, that really, so the question was, do you like to work remotely because you like the flexibility, because you like to take care of the family while you get things done? This stood out for me, right? So what does that say about bringing people into work, right? Well, you know, it's about 30 minutes of my time here, and I just want to end with where I started, right? See, this is simple, but yet it's extremely powerful. It does not happen very well. And it is often the root cause of lack and belonging. So you may change your processes, but if you don't change as a leader, you're not likely to have people stay. And I urge you to unlock and unleash potential by getting to know your people with a 3D lens. So thank you so much for listening.
Well, thank you, Malini. And there are a number of questions that came in, and maybe we can get into a little bit of a dialogue about this. By the way, I really appreciated you making reference to other spotlight sessions that we've had. You know, Jessica's, for example, or Vince's. Jessica's on people with disabilities, and Vince, obviously, and you mentioned that on leading with in English and focusing on accents and native speakers of English and non-native speakers of English. And these are just two dimensions that are in themselves extremely nuanced, right? And as you mentioned. But here is a question which I find really interesting, because obviously part of our community are a lot of people who work in the diversity, equity, and inclusiveness space. And so I want to, even though that wasn't the first question that came in, but I want to maybe spend a little bit of time there, because this 3D view, right, is more nuanced than oftentimes the DE&I initiatives in companies suggest, right? I mean, because oftentimes they topicalize gender, LGBTQ+, they topicalize race or ethnicity and a few other dimensions. But it seems to me that what you're saying is we need to step beyond that. And so how do you reconcile this tension that some of the categories that we use in the name of DE&I might actually be 2D dimensions, right? Yeah. And you're saying we need to really get deeper into the 3D. How do you see that relationship?
Yeah, and Jörg, this is often a classic discussion when it comes to diversity, right? Isn't diversity more than just the categories that we are hiring? Isn't it also based on skills and attitudes and et cetera, et cetera? So my answer is yes and yes. It's a yes and a yes. You cannot ignore the fact that we have to look at diversity dimensions of categories in order to hire people who are different. That's a space that we've got to start, and you got to do that. But that doesn't mean that you stop there. That's my premise. That doesn't mean you stop there, right? I mean, it's not a check the box exercise. That's the problem with when you do diversity with a check the box exercise. And you bring them in thinking that, oh, have added to the difference, but you really haven't, until you have taken advantage of the visible and the invisible differences, right? And so the invisible differences come with every human being. It doesn't matter whether you are white, male, white, female, Black, South Asian, it doesn't matter. So the invisible differences are just as important as the other categorical differences, and you apply it to everybody. So the inclusive leader, therefore, says, I am not going to just hold myself to to the category look. I'm going to get to know my people for beyond that as well, and take advantage of both. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. I think it makes a lot of sense to see the conventional DE&I categories as the starting point, not the end point, right? And there is a whole spectrum that matters to people. Right. That's maybe this ties a little bit in with another question around the role of attribution error, or I guess it's what is called, I think, the basic attribution error in a 2D and a 3D perspective. And oftentimes the attribution error is simply that we know our own actions, we know all the reasons that went into our own actions and our cognition, and we understand ourselves and our behavior in a very nuanced way. And oftentimes we make simple associations for why other people are doing what they are doing, right? Maybe it's because they are, and then oftentimes stereotypes fill in fill in the blank, you
Yes.
know, and
Yes.
how does that play with the 2D, 3D perspective?
Yeah. I think it plays right into that double loop learning that I talked about, right? Plays right in there. Because see, when you are truly open to learning about the process and what you are wanting to do as a leader, you're checking into these kinds of things. Absolutely. Because I think we're all human, right? It's human nature to do what you just discussed. This attribution error is human, right? And it's a fast-paced world. And so you're moving at such a fast pace. And so quick, you're moving on. So, but when you double loop the learning, this is one of the things you're checking into is your own bias, your own thinking. And you ask the question, I prefer to do it this way and it gets me the results. And therefore, am I attributing a different approach as wrong? Right? Mm-hmm. So you step back and you keep asking those kinds of questions, and really helps the leader learn about himself or herself a lot more and makes that self-awareness come alive, right? Yeah. Make that self-awareness come alive.
So on that point, there is another question here. First of all, there's a comment that simply states that I love the idea of relational Six Sigma, you know, so that's maybe an interesting, connection there between those two things. But the question is really, in our busy, oftentimes stressed professional lives, how do we practice double loop learning in the framework of this relational Six Sigma? How do we? Do you have some advice and some techniques of how we can actually do that, especially when we're in busy, stressed work environments?
You know, can you repeat the question? My internet was a little unstable.
Yes. So the question is really, how do we, when we are in busy and very stressed work environments, right? We're very busy, you know, and how do we practice this relational Six Sigma? How do we do double loop learning, if you will, amidst stress and high-paced work environments?
So, you know, that's a really good question. And I think it's fundamental to this process. And 25 years, I understand that fast-paced bias for action environment in which people live. So I'm not, minimizing that at all. You know, I'll have to tell you that one of the things that really resonated with me is a leader who said to me once, Malini, sometimes to go fast. Sometimes you've got to go slow to go fast. And I'll tell you why that resonates with me.
I think you're on a delay. There is a break in the connection, so you should be coming back any minute.
Here?
Now you're back.
I'm sorry.
On a bit of an unstable connection. So
yeah. So did you hear the leader who said, go slow to go fast?
Yes, that came through.
So what I think is very important here is to think of the time taken in the moment when you're checking yourself as an investment for the future, right? I mean, if you think about where and when you would stop and make investments in a process, I would say that's the way to think about this, is to step back and take a minute to stop and say, can I take a few more minutes to reflect on this? It's not easy, but I've seen leaders who do it well, make it a second nature. Make it second nature, even if you stop them in the hallway. I mean, now, of course, the virtual hallway, but if you'd stop them in the hallway and ask a question, right, they will pause. They will take the time to say, what do you think we should be doing about this? And so, yes, it's this trying to do relational Six Sigma says that you are on guard a lot with your people and your interactions. And every interaction, think of it as an opportunity to learn, right? So is it easy? No. Is it fruitful? Yes. And no one said leadership is easy.
So this ties directly into another question here, which is, you mentioned things like the hijab, or you mentioned in your own example, the importance of dharma that comes from being a devout Hindu. Now, the question goes, how these are sensitive topics, right? These are sensitive areas, and how do we actually make sure that we are not offending, or that we are opening up conversations that are actually being appreciated, so where people feel that there is a genuine sense of interest, of trust, of curiosity around very sensitive topics.
That is also very, very thoughtful questions, that are being asked here. So, Jorg, I've experienced this on both sides of the spectrum, right? As an employee who people were afraid to approach because I was different, and as a leader wanting to ask others questions. So, so I'm trying to think about that. I take me, for instance, you brought up this notion of who.
No.
I was very different, right?
You broke up for a moment.
Very.
You may need to repeat that last part.
So, let's see, are we back now? Yeah, we're back.
Yes,
now,
we are.
Yeah?
Yes, we are.
So, in a sea of people in South Bend, Indiana, I was one who was very different, right? And so, a lot of people would have would ask me sometimes, or would not ask me questions because they were afraid of offending, etc. And so, and I was longing for someone to even say, "Hey, Malini, tell me a little bit more about how you grew up." So, I guess my answer to that question would be, if you are authentic and you approach a person with genuine curiosity, and the word genuine is so important, and you are dropping your own assumptions and judgments, usually they find it a safe space and they don't worry about being offended. I mean, it's more a sharing. I remember the first time Warren Wilhelm, one of my good friends, who was asked me, "Hey, you're from Bangalore. Tell me more about it." It was like a floodgate opening up. It was like, so I would say, assume that there is a loneliness from not knowing about this individual that they are experiencing, and try it. Be vulnerable. You may not always succeed, but 9 times out of 10, you may, right? And so you got to try it as a leader, right? Now, on the employee side, if you think about this, right? And so you're wearing a hijab, and if you feel safe and comfortable, then it's likely that you may talk about your experiences when asked, right? I remember telling people, sometimes if I drive you crazy because I'd like to do everything right, I was raised with a sense of duty. Pardon me, right? As a leader, tell me when I'm overstepping my bounds, because it's part and parcel of who I am. So I would share. And so honestly, if you share, and why the hijab is so important to you, and again, I have to say, you've got to feel safe. Otherwise, it doesn't happen. So I would say, leaders, think about creating safe spaces and genuineness, and maybe that'll help.
And you alerted to the fact that it's not up to the leader to decide whether or not it's safe, right? I mean, I just spoke to somebody yesterday, in an executive leadership position, who just assumed and declared that everybody is safe on his team. But
no,
that's, who knows, right? I mean, that's a bias that makes.
Yes, and it's part of that subjective experience that I talked about, right? Yes. It's so part and parcel of this 3D view. don't assume that everybody's experience, this is that attribution bias. Don't assume that everybody is going to react to an experience just like you react to an experience, right? And so you got to get to know them a little bit more and say, what, that offended you? That didn't sit well with you? No. And subjective experiences cannot be objectified. It's subjective. That's why it's called a subjective experience, right?
So there is a question that ties right into that, and I don't want to forget that, and need to look at time as well. But the doing that in a virtual context or a remote context is the question states, like in an office environment, there are these moments, right, after a meeting or before a meeting starts, where we can more easily find time to maybe have these conversations. But in a virtual context, that seems to be harder to do.
That's also very pertinent to this, what's happening in the world today, right? I'll tell you, it's the meeting after the schedule one-on-ones with the individual right after the virtual call. Assume that you're in a hallway, do the virtual hallway chat. I mean, if you go in a meeting, you're going to do the meeting, you're going to walk out, you're going to pause in the hallway, and you're going to chat for a few minutes. So in any virtual situation, ahead of time, and I know you've set up a little debrief right after this call, right? Mm-hmm. I think that's a best practice. A better practice is to set up some time after the call to do a debrief. And in that debrief, please don't just talk about what was presented. Yes, it's very important. Yes, but also, an opportunity to get to know the person a little bit more, right? You did this very well here. How did that translate here, etc. So even 15 minutes, Jorg, even 15 minutes makes a huge difference to touch base with people. So I would say virtually set up the one-on-ones like you would in a hallway conversation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it takes a different structure to virtual workplaces, right? I mean, we need to perhaps schedule time for that we otherwise in an actual workplace we wouldn't need to schedule. But once we get into the habit, it may be different. That's part of creating new norms for this hybrid virtual.
Yes, because you see, the water cooler doesn't exist, right, in the virtual environment. So you've got to create psychological teaming or psychological interactions where you come together like you would at a water cooler. And chat, right? And virtual coffees. I see a lot of people doing that. Let's get
that's
coffee right. and let's talk. And let's not talk work. Let's talk about you.
Yeah, and what we talk about is important. There are two questions maybe we can still squeeze in. One is, from your perspective, is it a problem that HR policies tend to discourage personal questions in interviews? In other words, I'm interpreting that question now in a moment, but that oftentimes when it is about understanding potential and backgrounds and creating that 3D view of a potential employee, that policy-wise we can't get that information.
Yeah.
So, how do you think about that? I mean, you have an HR background as well, so.
Yeah, that's a good question, and there is a lot of people look at the questions very closely these days just to make sure that we're not breaking any laws. And I got to tell you, in the global world, it's very different. The kinds of questions that people ask in India in interviews is very different because the laws are very different over there.
Sure.
I consider some of them personal here or there. I would say that I think HR is working very hard to do their job. They really are. And if they are concerned, it's probably because there's a law that says you need to be concerned about it, right? And so you can certainly look at the questions and what they tell you not to ask and ask why. Can you tell me why I shouldn't ask that question? But, I would probably say work with them and not, upstream, because they're probably trying to do a job here. And then find ways in which you can loop what you want to ask in, perhaps, in a different way, in a different way. But they're trying to do their job, is what I'm trying to, I think I'm saying here. So,
well, and oftentimes I found that it's actually sensible to have those, to eliminate those personal questions or information from interviews and selection processes, because that's one way of mitigating bias, right, or unconscious bias. But that doesn't mean that once a person is hired, that therefore we shouldn't reach out. I remember one conversation with a manager where we had exactly this appeal, and get to know your people, ask questions, what do you know about people's background? And the manager looked at me and asked, do you mean I'm allowed to do this? Because I thought HR didn't want me to ask these questions.
Yes.
And my response was, well, this may be true for interviewing situations or selecting candidates, or, but it doesn't mean that once they're selected, once they're on your team, that you should therefore keep kind of this clinical distance. And so oftentimes managers, I think, are confused about this.
You're absolutely right. There's a world of difference between an HR interview and what you can ask after you've hired a person in. Yeah. There is a world of difference. Yeah. And so I would say, and please be vulnerable. Give it a try. Give it a try. Yes. So
the last question, which I think was also a really good one, we talked a lot about getting to know your people as a leader or as a manager, but how about your people getting to know you?
You mean for the employee to get to know the leader?
That's right.
Yes. Just as important. Because you see, if you just ask and not share, it's a one-way street, and they're not likely to open up. So every leader I coach, when they ask me the question, I'd say, please, if you are not comfortable sharing of yourself, get comfortable. Yeah. Because it's not going to work. It's not, it's not a one-way street. It's not a one-way street. So thank you for asking that question. And I probably should have said that in the presentation. It's just as important for you to open up as a leader and share, including your hotspots. Why am I reacting to things that I do that way? This is who I am. And that's another way you're going to get feedback as a leader. Right.
And sometimes it's good to do that actually as part of the team formation process, right? So people get to know one another.
There is a great process. There's a great process called the new manager assimilation process, where, the leader talks about hotspots, leaves the room, comes back. And so if anyone wants to try that, please check it out.
Yeah, that's great.
Yes.
Well, and it brings us back full circle to your introductory activity you had us all do, namely to kind of just think about all these dimensions that make up you, right? And those would be dimensions that leaders can perhaps share with the people that they work with.
Yes.
To cultivate that 3D perspective with everyone.
That is absolutely spot on. I completely agree.
Great. Well, I see we are just about at time. I want to thank you, Malini, for sharing this perspective and encouraging all of us to move from a 2D to a 3D perspective, which sounds more simple than it actually is. But when we do it, we are really tapping the potential of our people and of ourselves, I would say, as well. And sometimes in very surprising ways. And that really can unlock and unleash a lot of that potential you talked about.
Thank you.
Thank you, Malini. And thanks everyone for joining this Spotlight session.